Hi, and welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, John Euler returns for part 2 with Nadine Ness of United Grassroots out of Saskatchewan, right here in Canada. There's lots to come on this part 2 episode. Stay right there. We'll be back right after this.
Exposing SOGI123.com provides all the info you'll need to protect your children and family from this transgender ideology. Exposing SOGI123.com has done all the work for you to take a stand and be heard. With dozens of letters pre-written to every official you can think of within your province, the documents provided are fill in the blank so you can amend and send. It's that simple. Make your voice heard and count for the children to the highest levels of provincial and so-called federal political leaders, health ministers, school board officials, and more. Exposing SOGI123.com, where the facts are real.
Welcome back. John Euler is standing by along with Nadine Ness. They have so much to talk about today. A real educational and eye-opener information that you won't find anywhere else. That's what's happening on Unmasking the Trans Movement. Part 1 is there and ready to go for everybody to take a look at. If you're just joining us for part 2, welcome back. There is a lot of information to kind of take home with you from part 1, but part 2 is going to be even more eye-opening for parents and grandparents alike. With that, let's bring in John Euler and Nadine Ness at the same time. Thank you very much for being here to both of you. John, part 1 was eye-opening for a lot of people. There was a lot of information there that people can go back and go through. What's coming up in the second half, John?
Brad, Nadine, and welcome back, Nadine. She is going to help educate us on how within schools the sexualization of kids through the SOGI Sex Ed material, the sexual orientation and gender identity material, so the trans-related sex ed that's currently in schools is the perfect grooming material for predators to be able to cross sexual boundaries. And that's why it's such an important thing. It's really urgent because this stuff, all these policies, single sex bathrooms, allowing young men into the girls' rooms, into their locker rooms and bathrooms, restrooms, even being on sports teams. My contention, having worked and working with sex offenders, Nadine, we mentioned last time, or you gave your background as law enforcement and you worked with and profiled sex offenders. So that informs our concerns. So if people want to try to say we're phobic, we're hateful, no, we're coming from a public safety issue. And people need to understand how predators are using the trans movement and those that are pushing these policies, especially in schools. This is a gold mine for a predator. And we had just talked about at the end, so I do recommend people go back and watch part 1, because there's a ton of information, is that I had begun referencing that the term marginal or vulnerable group, they are vulnerable kids. I had mentioned there are no such things as trans kids. Now, I'm in the States and I can say that. Let me qualify that statement. What I say is this: there are no trans kids because there's nothing genetic about this. This is a mental perspective. These are kids that somebody's been grooming them one way or the other. They've been confusing these kids. They're gender confused. But for those countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, where somebody wants to try to parse words and say, John, no, there are trans people. Okay, I'll give you that title. But the reality is this: if you and your policies to any lawmaker are making it easier for kids to be preyed upon, groomed, and preyed upon, then you have taken kids, many of whom in this movement either have autism disorder and or have been sexually violated in some capacity. Their boundaries have already been crossed. Then you're taking kids that already have a difficult time with their intuition and sexual boundaries. Now you're introducing hypersexualized pornographic material, and that's all a perpetrator needs. And so, Nadine, as you were talking about, that's where your concern is, and you were mentioning off mic that because you were quote unquote gender non-conforming, part of that came out of your own abuse background, that you didn't want attention, that if you had been raised in this day and age, you would have been a perfect target to be convinced that you weren't a girl, but you were a boy, and off down the medicalization moving sidewalk toward amputation of sex organs, you would have gone. You would have been encouraged that way.
Yeah, I'll get into that. So for the people who may not have seen episode 1, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. My offender pedophile was convicted and jailed over the abuse. And when all that came out, I was about 10 years old. And when you're a victim of something like that, your way of coping is not always ideal or the healthy way. How I coped at the time, I wanted no attention from males. My offender was a male. And any type of flirting or attention I had from males re-triggered my trauma. And so because of that, it's like a self-defense mechanism. I dressed like a boy. I acted like a boy. I played, all my friends were boys, because I figure if I was one of them, I would have no attention drawn upon me. And that went on until I started puberty. In fact, if I had been in current day-to-day schools, if they had offered, oh, maybe you are a boy, I would have jumped on it out of sheer preservation, because I knew, okay, that means I won't get attention from boys. And it wasn't until puberty hit where it kind of changed. And throughout, because it was made public, what happened to me, I did get psychological services, even school counselor. It's not like I wasn't getting help or that it was hidden. I did get the help, but still it didn't change the fact that that's how I survived. And it wasn't until puberty hit that it all started to change. I wanted the attention from boys once the hormones started. And now looking back, like, yes, I'm very much, I like male dominated things. I like woodworking, construction. I was a police officer, which is very much male dominated. So that's not going to change. But had I been in today's day and age, I might have lost out on the one thing that I love most about my life, and that's my children and becoming a mother. And I have huge concerns when there's only one direction that is being addressed when it comes to children who are potentially in the same situation I am, where the trauma might not be dealt with, or they might be pushing a certain thing and not realizing that once puberty hits, that will likely change. For most of these gender non-conforming children, once puberty hits, it changes. And you're seeing that happen a lot, but now they're talking about blocking puberty. I have huge concerns with that. And I think only one side is kind of being discussed or allowed, and they're not allowing the other side to talk. I wish more people would hear my personal experience and then say, okay, let's wait and see what happens. And I wish more of these medical professionals or psychologists or even school counselors were to pay a little bit more attention to the trauma instead of just pushing, oh, well, you must be trans, so we're going to push that direction.
But
and
Nadine,
I don't think that's happening.
Right. My contention is this, that it's such a huge concern because within the realm of mandated reporters, you have different professions, and mental health and teachers are mandated reporters. What's happened is, and I've been doing therapy now for about 30 years, so I have a little bit of perspective just as far as age. But there was a day and age where any mandated reporter, but especially in the mental health field, could rattle off the 9 key red flag indicators of abuse. You had to, so that you could be mindful of who you were working with, and especially with a child, they're not going to come out with, no child's going to walk up saying, I'm being perped on. Just doesn't, so-and-so's touching me. 99.9% of all kids, they're going to show warning, they're going to show red flags, they're going to show evidence of being perpetrated against. If you have someone who's in a position who is a mandated reporter, if they aren't mindful of those, then you unknowingly will give you the best benefit of the doubt. Then at the very least, if what you've done is, if you bought into this ideology and this movement, then you're now trained and you're taught to reframe those 9 red flag indicators of abuse. You're reframing them in terms of gender confusion, and off to the medicalization clinic you go. And now it's just adding insult to injury. So there needs to be, we need to go back to the education of not too many decades ago, where we could spot a potential victim rather than keeping a kid silent, not asking the right questions, not exploring what this means. So if a girl walks up to either in session or in class for a teacher saying, I hate being a girl, I wish I was a boy, that's the number one red flag that the child is being perped on. And now we've reframed it for what?
I think that's so true. It should be a number one indicator that child might be a victim. And sometimes it's not even just sexual abuse. Sometimes it's physical abuse or just really unhealthy family relation at home as well. Like, it's not always just sexual abuse, but yeah, it should be the number one indicator. And I find that the schools don't do enough to educate the teachers on that. And it's very much like one-sided now with the conversations. And I know psychologists are even afraid of going into asking what is their trauma, because then they it's almost like, oh, well, it's almost like conversion therapy if you're trying to deal with the trauma instead of just pushing that one-sided narrative. I wish there was more clarification for psychologists on that particular thing, where educating, okay, you can deal with the trauma, you can try to find out if there's trauma. It doesn't mean it's conversion therapy. But I find these policies have created an atmosphere of fear, even from psychologists who would want to go and find out, okay, well, maybe you're just confused thinking you're gay because you had an adult female abuse you and your body didn't react in arousal, and she accused you of being gay because you didn't have an arousal. Like, that's a gentleman that I was speaking to just recently. He thought he was gay for a really long time because a woman abuser tried to physically assault him and his body didn't react in arousal, and then she accused him of being gay. And so he questioned himself for a really long time. So, but we can't even have those conversations, because if it goes against the pushing a certain narrative, I think if you go anything that's towards cisgender or heterosexual, I think that's how the new legislation is worded, is anything that pushes towards being heterosexual is conversion therapy. And I think that's so wrong on so many levels, because we're not dealing with the trauma. I think sometimes when you start dealing with the trauma, you realize that, okay, they aren't gay. They just had this really traumatic experience, and that created that. And I'm not saying that's the case for everyone. There are clearly cases where you have children who always knew they were gay from a very young age. But there are situations where it's not like that. And unfortunately, we've created a problem in society where you can't even talk about it. And the reason that has happened, the biggest reason that has happened, is the only people who have been allowed to determine which direction we go are activists from the LGBTQ community. And anyone who kind of opposes that and say, wait a minute, they're silent. So I think we need to come back to a more level playing field when it comes to the discussion, and for it not to be led by LGBTQ activists in the medical community, in the school area, in kind of all the areas we're seeing this ideology come in. It's only one voice that is making the decision, unfortunately, and that needs to change.
And those would be, we could categorize those as sectors or individuals that have, or organizations that have something to gain by moving a child in a certain direction. If you really care about a child, you're going to have the child's best interest at heart. Certainly, I think, hopefully, everybody can agree upon the idea that if you allow a child's body to stay in a healthy state, that's best. That's in the best interest of the kid. The less medicalization of a child, the better off the child will be in the long run. If you start fooling around with the child's healthy endocrine system, probably not a good thing. We're already seeing, and we've seen a lot of issues happening, and that's not even just psychological issues and regret. So let kids be kids. Don't medicalize their bodies. And if a child is having gender-related issues, we need to be able to explore that, because it could be legitimate, but oftentimes something has begun to groom them. That simply means something or someone's working on them, because there are financial predators and sexual predators. Nadine, you mentioned last time how pedophiles have infiltrated these groups, because if I'm a pedophile and I work with them, you've worked with them in the past, right? We know how they think. They never take any time off. They're always on. They are predators. So they're always thinking about how to cross boundaries, and they do it very strategically. And the SOGI Sex Ed, if you had a pedophile sit down and write his perfect way of gaining access to a kid and grooming him, and what he would introduce, and the methodology and the chapter by chapter, you'd end up with SOGI Sex Ed.
Yeah, and you talk about the easy access. We also have to understand that the trans movement get a pass in behavior that if it was to be anyone in the general public to do the same kind of behavior, the public would be outraged. So, and you're seeing
guys dressing, guys being nude, but because they have a wig on and they cover their penis in glitter, suddenly it's not indecent exposure. It's just art.
Or someone saying to a child, well, no one understands you the way I do. Like, and any other adult was to say that to a child, you'd be like, okay, alarm bells here, right? But because there's someone who's from that community, it's almost like, well, they're trans. There's not a lot of trans, so we're gonna let them team up with this child and talk. And we have to understand as well why, when you talk about gender ideology or sexual orientation, it's not just talking to a child about nothing, about their pastime. It's talking to a child about something that is of sexual nature. Gender ideology and sexual orientation is sexual nature. So you're allowing a conversation between an adult that's not the family member to talk to a child about something of sexual nature. And I find, again, these are all alarm bells that rings in my head. And I think more needs to be done to protect children. And I think we need to really reevaluate, like you said, is it in the children's best interest? Well, I can tell you, blocking puberty is not in the children's best interest. Blocking puberty can have lasting effects, not just on the body. Part of our brain development is actually from puberty hormones. So there was a gentleman that reached out to me from BC. He's a professor at the university, and he studies specifically the effect of hormones on brain development. And he said, we don't even know the level of how it affects, because we're not going to know till 20 years from now what effect these puberty blockers will have on these children. They're basically experimenting on them. It could completely affect not just the physical body or the chance of having children. It could actually affect the brain development. And we're just saying, okay, let's give it a go, because this child is confused. This child's going to be sad if we say no. And I think the medical community actually is really failing children, because they're doing these experiments without actually having proper studies done. And I will also add, the studies that are out there showing support for this are extremely bad science. And unfortunately, most doctors are afraid of losing their license if they speak out against it. But we're starting to see, especially in Europe, studies come forward that show that transing a child actually has longer negative effects and higher increased risk of suicide. You had one study that came out, I don't remember if it was what country it was from, somewhere in Europe. I'll find it. Maybe I'll send it to you and you can link it in a past episode. But I think we need to do more studies on it. And unfortunately, anyone who tries, the activists come after them. But I'm hoping there's going to be some government somewhere with some backbone into maybe putting money towards doing this, instead of just pushing this ideology onto our kids. So
right.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
A number of the there's thousands of detransitioners that had different degrees of medicalization. Numbers of them have underwent double mastectomies. Chloe Cole, Kaiser Permanente out in California. Now, here's the irony. She's suing, and hopefully she will win, because no child, no minor can give informed consent. Especially if they have mental health issues. And all of these kids have co-occurring disorders. So unless somebody can comprehend, so can you imagine taking a kid, why don't we allow 16-year-olds to drink? Because we all say, well, we understand about brain development. They can't, we have various, you drive first and then you're of legal age to drink. Because they can't meaningfully take in and process and comprehend and apprehend the long-term consequences. So if you take a troubled 12-year-old or 13-year-old or 14-year-old and talk to them about, hey, you probably won't be able to have kids for the rest of your life if you take this stuff. A 14-year-old's going, well, I don't want kids. Okay, well, you might have some bone issues, osteoporosis. Well, that's fine. There's no way a kid can comprehend, even for adults, when we look at the side effects of potential medication. They show them on TV, up come all these side effects, but we adults are still willing to say, well, yeah, but it'll help my acid reflux. Yeah, I might die in 2 years, but, right? So even adults have a hard time really allowing themselves to have the weight of the meaning and the implications of something sink in. There's no way a child who is not doing well psychologically and emotionally, who is going through puberty, they've got emotions, they've got peer pressure, there's no way the child is going to be able to think through those implications, so they cannot give informed consent. So coming down the pike then, right, we're going to have massive issues. Scott Nugent is a woman who went through transition. She was on the film What is a Woman? With Matt Walsh's film, and look at Scott has said he doesn't think he's going to be around much longer because of the health implications. And that was before this tidal wave of kids that are being manipulated.
And it's funny because if you talk about this in Canada, they'll say, oh, but it's not happening to children in Canada. And I don't know if you saw the recent report within the National Post. It came out September 29th. I think that might be today. Hundreds of trans teens under 18 have had breasts removed in Canada, new study shows. So they're saying it's not happening. It is happening. And you have to look at as well the other negative effects that it has on these children. You talk about informed consent. The key part there, informed. If you tell a kid who goes on puberty blockers, hey, you may lose your sex drive for the rest of your life. Like some of these puberty blockers are actually what we give pedophiles so that they don't offend. So it takes away their sex drive. Like it medically castrates them. And this is the same thing they're giving to these kids.
That would be Lupron for people
Lupron. Yes. So it doesn't always work and in sex offenders, because some of the offenders, their motivation is not actually sexual drive, but it makes people believe.
That's right.
It makes people believe that they're less likely to offend. So castrating, same thing. You'll still have some offenders that it will actually make it worse. But that's a story for another day. I'm sure you might be aware of that. But yeah, the informed part is they don't usually get the full story. And that's what you're seeing. I think in 20 years from now, we're going to look back and say, maybe we should have done something about this, or maybe we should have looked into it. And I think you're going to see a lot of cases where they're going to want to, a lot of cases where they will sue. But I will also add that that's when we're talking about medical transitioning. But what about social transitioning? I think that's not talked about enough, because we don't understand that there's also negative effects of social transitioning. Like you have Chloe and Scott that later on in life realized they wanted to transition back, and they had medical parts. But what about the children who just want to transition back because of socially? I remember what it's like being a kid, and when you're labeled something, that follows you for the rest of your life. And unfortunately, socially transitioning as well can have really long-lasting negative effects, where children, once they hit puberty, might change their mind, but they'll be like, oh, but then everyone will know I was wrong. That like they might continue on that path just because they don't want to be seen as having done the wrong thing. So we have to talk about too the negative effects of socially transitioning children before they hit puberty. I know in Saskatchewan we kind of moved towards there's policy put in place, but now the injunction has paused it. But I'm fully in agreement with that, because 16, by then you should have started hitting puberty. So that's the age that they're saying that you need parental consent. But I also like the idea of getting parental consent, because a parent will know what kind of struggle that child has had for their entire life. Do they have other mental health conditions that might be affecting this? And if you're not bringing in the parent into that discussion, like for example, there's a lady that reached out to me 2 weeks ago, and her son was autistic, severely autistic, and in grade 9. And I've been given permission to share this story. I'm not going to share the name because the parent doesn't want to be attacked from the LGBTQ community or the activist community. But her son, who's severely autistic, went to school, and earlier that week, his best friend, who was a female, had her birthday party, and it was a sleepover, and he wasn't allowed to go because they come from a very strict faith background, and they didn't want a boy sleeping at the slumber party. And he was upset when he got to school, and the teacher asked him, "Why are you upset?" And he said, "I want to be a girl." And then the school actually went to the level of transitioning this autistic boy in school because he was upset, wanted to be a girl, because he wanted to go. And this boy is severely autistic, and the family found out after it had already started, and thankfully it was during COVID, and the school ended up closing, and they ended up homeschooling their son. And eventually he realized, okay, there's a difference. His aha moment was actually when he was at the dentist, and the dentist was talking about bone structures, how boys and girls have different bone structures. He's like, "Oh, I'm a boy." And then he's back to like being a boy. But the idea that happened, like they even involved social services, because the parents were like, "He's autistic. He doesn't understand what it means." And and it was just unreal. But you're seeing situations like that where it makes you wonder, like, have we lost our mind?
Was that in Saskatchewan?
Yeah. And where's the common sense? Like, and I just find, again, these are not discussions that are allowed in the public square, which is really unfortunate, because we need to recognize there are different nuances. There are people who, yes, people who have good intentions, but there's also people who don't, and who want to almost be like the hero, the hero mentality. Well, I'm going to be a hero for this kid. And then there's the other ones where they are predators, and schools are a big area where they hide. And again, like I said in the last episode, I find a lot of things really concerning, and I'm not alone in that. I've had so many police officers, current serving and retired police officers, reach out to me and like, thank you for raising the alarm, because they see what's happening and they're concerned too, but either they're afraid to lose their job or just not in a position where they can kind of raise awareness. So I think you're going to start seeing that happen a little bit more. But again, with the injunction application going through, I don't know if you knew, Brad and John, in Saskatchewan, these new changes, activist group filed a lawsuit and applied for an injunction on these new changes requiring parental consent and parents being informed. And the judge in Saskatchewan granted that injunction, which I just find shocking. So I don't foresee it staying.
I don't see it as shocking. I mean, we know the court systems here in Canada are corrupt at this point. There's a lot going on within our judicial system that is being led by, well, Justin Trudeau, the puppet, and the World Economic Forum. So, look, people are starting to wake up. I think that the Million March for Children was an eye-opener to a lot of Canadians that there is something really big going on. It's going to take people a little while to join and get involved and become that individual who wants to march or activate. But I see an increase in momentum, and the march, I think, created that, much like the convoy created some of that for us here in Canada too. And that momentum with the trans movement and the anti-trans movement is starting to formulate a lot of ideas that we were never, ever prepared to even have to address, that, you know, we're having to think outside the box in so many different ways just to be able to, I guess, come up with our own plan going forward. Their plan on the other side is very well laid out, very well documented. The DSM-5 and others that have created this indoctrination information and advertising campaign after advertising campaign has really put us in a place where if we don't get organized ourselves, we're going to have a real hard time keeping up or even just catching up. It's in our schools. It's in our sport systems. They're teaching coaches now that we have to be accepting. Of course, that's all the other words, again, that are part of this indoctrination. Family friendly, inclusive, you know, those are just a couple. But the sports side of it is another aspect that they're attacking and getting us coaches to start to bend our, you know, I guess address the situations in front of us. I have seen kids that I believe to be are confused. And I just got done going through hockey tryouts. And so where does that confusion come from? If you look at them in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, they're not the same individual as they are today. And what's changed? It's the indoctrination that comes out in these schools where these teachers have 8 hours or 6 hours in a classroom to push this information, to have the flags on the walls that you would never put in your house, you would never fly on your car, or never fly in your backyard for that matter. But here we are. They're up in the schools, the pamphlets are being handed out. You know, I can't say enough, Nadine, about all the work that you do. I'm aware of you through some very some very outspoken people here in Manitoba. Shadow Davis with the Shadow Davis Show, Mike Voyage from Voyage Funeral Homes. You know, I've seen what you're all about, and your Unified Grassroots is really as well creating momentum and focus and attention to the issue at hand. And I do appreciate that, and I know that a lot of Canadians are starting to learn your name. And like Dr. Ann Gillies, and Shadow Davis and Mike Voyage, and even myself for that matter, because we just keep at it. The message is getting out, and it might be only a few day by day. At least we are making progress in some sort of fashion. And as long as we don't give up, I think we can ultimately get a level-headedness back into our school systems, our judicial system, and most of all, within our own family core values.
Brad and I couldn't say it any better. And so, Nadine, thank you so much. We could keep you here for 3 hours, quite frankly, but thank you for what you do. Thank you for being our guest, and for, as a former law enforcement officer that has profiled and worked with sexual offenders, hopefully parents now are going to take this, as well as educators are going to take this more seriously, that we're not anti-trans. We are pro the protection of women and children. This is a public safety issue. And if we care about kids, we're not going to unduly influence them. We want the best for them. So I say we sort of leave kids alone, let kids be kids, and they'll usually do okay that way. So Nadine, thank you so much for being on our program. Would you let people know again how they can get a hold of you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter, Nadine G. Ness, as well on Facebook, Unified Grassroots. We have a public page and a private page. And I think that's it. We're going to move to Instagram maybe eventually, but I'm not an Instagram person, so it's made it a bit difficult. But I just want to add one last thing, if that's okay. You talked about indoctrination in school, and one of the biggest things we hear, well, that's not happening in schools. And I want to bring your attention to audio that I released on my Twitter a few months ago about a conversation between a principal and a parent, where the principal saying, well, 32% of the kids in our school grades 7 to 12 identify as LGBTQ. 32%. And he didn't even see anything wrong in that. So we have to recognize as well what is happening in society, because that number is reflected in schools kind of across Saskatchewan as well across Canada, and that's not reflected in society. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves what is happening. And I'm not going to say every teacher, but it doesn't take many teacher activists to push that number up. In one small town close to me, 13 out of 30 kids in grade 8 classroom identify as LGBTQ, and that's 43%. And I asked the boy who was telling me about it, he said, oh, we just had a teacher in grade 6 that was talking about it almost every day and celebrating anyone who came forward as LGBTQ. There was preferential treatment. And it didn't happen in grade 7 and 6 because that teacher went on mat leave. So grade 7 and 6 didn't have those kinds of numbers, just grade 8. And we have to recognize when something is happening. And I'm hoping there's going to be progress in the future. And we're going to lobby for that as an organization. Is this in the kids' best interest?
Well, I want to encourage people to go on if they have access to Twitter, if they haven't been banned. If you've been banned, go back and appeal now. But a lot of information on Nadine's site. So again, I'll scroll up, watch your eyes here. There we go. So you'll know you're on the right site right there. So
thank
Nadine,
you again for having me.
Well, thank you for making the time out of your busy schedule. And Brad, this has been like so many of our guests, we have true subject matter experts, and Nadine has lived it, and she comes from a number of vantage points. So we're very appreciative, and it's been an eye-opening 2-part program.
Well, I'd love to have you back for more, Nadine. I know that this isn't going to be a talk about it today and it's over tomorrow. So We need to stay focused. And one of the things I liked about your name of Unified Grassroots was the unified part. That's the one thing that needs to happen in this country. We need to stand up together. We need to get a plan together, and we need to initiate that plan together as one, not as multiple groups, not as individuals even. The individuals are being beat up after the fact. The trans movement will activate and come after those individuals and ruin their jobs, their livelihoods, their reputations. They'll take them to town, and unfortunately in this day and age with not enough people quite recognizing what's happening, they get the upper hand on us that way. So if we stick together, I truly believe that we have more power, and I think the people bring the power rather than the individual brings the power. So, let's stay unified. That's why I brought that word up, was because it really does fit in this situation. If we can bring people together and get them educated enough that they can actually activate themselves to notice what's going on and then find the information that they need to educate themselves so that they can have the proper discussions, especially with their kids. Their kids are the most important out of all of this, and if you're not talking to your kids, who are you talking to? Because the trans movement isn't listening to you, and nobody truly is willing to even engage with a lot of people when they bring up this subject. They go, oh, no, I don't want to talk about it. But the reality is, stop talking to the wrong people and let's start talking to the right people, and that's our kids. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Thanks for being here today to both John and Nadine. There is so much to find. Check out our website at unmaskingthetransmovement.com. You can find us on Rumble, BitChute, and also YouTube now. Till next time, I'm Brad Wilder reminding you it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight. We'll see you soon.